Extension beef cattle specialist here at Oklahoma State. I have a split extension and applied research appointment. Dr. Biggs, myself, Dr. Paul Beck have been coordinating these Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime series since spring of 2020. Go ahead, Dr. Biggs and Dr. Peel, if you would please.
Good afternoon, everybody. We do want to point out a few things. Hopefully you've had a chance to see Dr. Lallman's slides that have gone through while you've waited to join. We've got a good crowd, a little over 70 folks on this afternoon, and I think we'll probably expect a handful more as we get past the noon hour. So I'm Rosalind Biggs. I'm a beef cattle extension specialist housed within the College of Veterinary Medicine. So I have a little bit of a split appointment between vet med and extension.
Hi, I'm Paul Beck. My video does not work today for some reason, but nobody needs to really see me. Anyway, I'm a extension beef cattle specialist here at the Department of Animal and Food Sciences in Stillwater, and once again, like to welcome everybody to the Ranchers Thursday. Looking forward to a great meeting today.
All right, thank you. So this is the third in a series. I'll just remind you again that if you just type in beef.okstate.edu, you can get to the recording from today. That will be posted generally in about 2 days. I would guess this time, since they've got the university shut down again on Friday, they may not be available until early next week. But we've asked each presenter each week to provide a PDF file of the presentation, so you can listen to the recording, watch their presentation on the recording, or you can thumb through that PDF file if you'd rather do that. So our first speaker this afternoon, as we continue a third session in this series of preparing for the potential of extended drought, is Mr. Wes Lee. Wes has been part of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service for a long time now. He was one of our outstanding extension educators, a couple of different counties, as I recall, Wes, and we were fortunate to recruit him to represent the Oklahoma Mesonet, particularly from an agricultural education side. And so Wes is very well equipped and very well experienced over the last few years to cover this topic in terms of where are we at now and what can we expect in terms of the weather. Wes?
All right, I'll try to jump right into a slide program and start sharing the screen. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Lallman. I have been with the Cooperative Extension Service now for a little over 33 years. So I've got a little bit of a history with OSU with that. And if we can get this to there, is that looking okay, Dr. Lallman?
Looks great.
Okay. So been asked today to come and visit with you for a few minutes about a little bit about an outlook or weather outlook for what we've got looking forward to in the spring. Of course, as far as a weather standpoint, things have not been real rosy for us the last few months, and we're going to delve into that and look at some of those things here for the next few minutes. The big elephant in the room has been this INSO weather pattern. We happen to be under a La Nina weather pattern. It is a powerful one this year. And the definition of a La Nina is when we have cooler than normal water temperatures, surface water temperatures in the southern Pacific. And as you can see in this map here off the coast of South America, you see all the blue colors. We're currently running somewhere a little over 1 degree Celsius below the long-term average for those water temperatures. And that cooler weather then, or cooler water temperature impacts our weather patterns. Now, as not being a meteorologist, the first thing that I thought of when I first started looking at this INSO weather pattern, La Nina, El Nino, is how could we have cooler weather or cooler water conditions there in that Pacific when the air temperature of the world, especially last year, has been so warm? And it comes to find out that temperatures really don't impact per se those water temperatures that impact this system. It has more to do with powerful westerly winds that blow off the coast, pushing those warmer surface waters to the west, and that lets those cooler waters underneath well up to the surface. It's kind of like when we experience pond turnover or lake turnover in the fall in Oklahoma, where those cooler water temperatures move up to the surface. And as you can see here, when we have the La Nina conditions, the globe on the right, we tend to have a jet stream that gets pushed to the north that impacts our weather in the southern part of the United States by making our conditions drier than normal and warmer than normal. I do want to point out, I don't know if the cursor will show up. It's hard to see the state of Oklahoma on this map because it's so obscured, but basically northeast Oklahoma would be right where the jet line touches the state of Oklahoma. So in a minute, I'll show you some maps to where possibly that part the far northeastern Oklahoma may not be experiencing the same kind of conditions the rest of the state is. Now, the question would be, how long are we going to stay in this La Nina weather pattern? And this map is really hard to read, and I apologize for that. I just want you to kind of focus on two lines, if you can see them, the red line and the green line. And those are basically the averages, the dynamic and statistical averages of all the weather patterns, looking at those water temperatures, trying to depict when they will move back to a neutral or zero by this dark line here. And you can see that all of the patterns tend to come together, moving them above the normal line or to the normal line sometime in June, July, or August, or basically when summer begins. Now, unfortunately for us, this weather pattern tends to influence our weather in the wintertime and in the early spring. So by the time it moves to the neutral INSO pattern in the start of summer, the influences of this weather pattern are going to be pretty much long gone anyway, and it won't have much of an impact on our weather going forth. But until then, it looks like the La Nina pattern is going to stay locked in, and we're going to continue to experience the conditions that we tend to get from that. Another large map that's probably difficult to see there, but this is the 20 strongest La Nina weather patterns over the last 70 years or so. And you can see that not always do we have a La Nina pattern that's going to give us dry conditions in Oklahoma. Sometimes we have wetter than normal conditions, but about 65 or 70% of the time, you'll notice that these brown conditions in the stronger La Nina years tend to take hold in Oklahoma. And so we have a tendency to have those drier than normal conditions. Some of you may remember just a year ago, we had a very similar presentation on this same forum if you participated, and we were talking about La Nina conditions last year as well. Fortunately, the pattern didn't seem to influence our weather that dramatically last year. It was a weaker La Nina. And for most of the state, with the panhandle excluded, we had a fairly wet spring in Oklahoma. The problem with La Nina, especially that is pointed out if you really study these maps, is that when we have a La Nina back-to-back, 2 years in a row, as I've indicated here by these circles, this was 2007-8 and 2008 and 9. The second year of a La Nina tends to be almost always drier than normal, as you can see on that circled 2008-2009 year. And since we have a back-to-back La Nina, this year is stronger than last year. I think those conditions are taking hold a lot more this year than they did last year. Okay, how has that impacted us in the state? Well, I don't have to tell you how dry it's been for those of you in the West. You've experienced it, you know it. But let's look at a few graphs. or a few maps. Here is rainfall for the cool season planting season that would run from September 1 through today. You know, important weather conditions for our wheat crop, fescue crop for those of you in the east. And you can see that nowhere in the state are we above normal rainfall based on this particular time of the growing season. But I can't see it on my map because of something on my screen. I'm going to try to move. Yeah, there I can see. All right. If you'll look in the northeast part of Oklahoma, we have a 99% up there in Miami in the far northeast part of Oklahoma. Remember, I showed you that jet stream that barely touches the northeastern corner of Oklahoma during a typical La Nina pattern. And maybe we're getting some of that influence in the far northeastern counties to where we're getting fairly close to normal rainfall, but the state as a whole is well below normal. And if you look at the eastern or western half of the state, it's much, much lower than we'd like to see this time of year. The Panhandle, of course, being the worst part of the state. Trying to get there. Looking at rainfall for the past 30 days, one thing Mesonet is not good at is measuring snow precipitation. So we may have underestimated a little bit of rainfall from the last two snow events or ice events in the west, but we capture most of it eventually here. Regardless of that, you can see that it's definitely a have or have not situation. The east has received some fairly significant rainfall in the last 30 days. However, most of the west has struggled to come near that inch of rainfall over 30 days. And of course, that's definitely impacting our growing conditions. One thing we are good at is measuring that moisture as snow melts as it moves into the ground. So it would be representative on our soil moisture maps. This particular soil moisture map happens to be one we call fractional water index, which is a very simple scale from 0 to 1. 0 being as dry as the sensor can read, and 1 being as wet as that sensor can read at that particular depth. Here we're looking at 10 inches. So the sensor that's buried to 10 inches in the soil, these are the readings that it's actually reading. And you can see that basically I-35 divides the state. The eastern half of the state is in great conditions moisture-wise in the soil at 10 inches, whereas most of those western sites are showing some lack of moisture in the soil at this depth. And some of these dark red colors are showing some severely impacted soil moisture conditions out there. What about temperature? Well, this is the temperature graph since September of last year on 2021 that goes through the end of 2021. And you can see the dark bar in the middle would be normal. And we spent most of the days above that normal line. So warmer than normal definitely seems to be the pattern in 2021. If we looked at 2022 to date, it would be a little closer to normal if you average the dates together, but it's simply because of three very, very significant cold fronts. One of them we're experiencing again today, along with a bunch of really warm days in January and February to date. But definitely 2021, the latter part of the year, we spent the year much warmer than normal. That's highlighted by December, as you can see on this map. When you look at the maximum high temperatures averaged over the entire 31 days for December, we came in at a whopping 12 to 15 degrees above normal for the year, or for the month of December. This blew the last record out of the water by about 7 or 8 degrees. So a very, very warm December, the warmest December ever on record here for Oklahoma. And that definitely has impacted our average wintertime temperatures looking at this winter season. Okay, how does that impact the drought? The drought maps, well, the drought maps, as you probably know, come out every Thursday morning at 7 a.m. So this is the latest drought map for the state. You can see all of the red, the the dark reds in the panhandle there. We happen to be currently at about 93% of the state in either abnormally dry or some level of drought in the state. About the only good news I can say about this drought map is that it's about 4% better this week than it was last week. And we are slightly better than we were at the start of the year by about 1, maybe 2% better than we were at the start of the year. If we look at where that improvement has been, it's been primarily just in the south, the far southeast part of Oklahoma. If you remember that 30-day rainfall map, some of those areas did pick up 3 or 4 inches of rain. So the improvement has mainly just been in that part of the state. Okay, the National Drought Map also come out this morning, as it does every Thursday morning. And you can see that parts of the United States have shown some improvement in the last several weeks. The Californias, the Arizonas have gotten a little bit better. But as far as major cattle producing areas, Oklahoma, especially Western Oklahoma, the Texas Panhandle, and Montana seem to be bearing the worst part or the brunt of the drought conditions in major cattle producing areas today. Well, let's switch over to forecast a little bit. A little of you, or most of you, are probably like me, been dealing with calving season right now, and this cold front that we're still in the middle of right now has definitely impacted, made calving difficult, dealing with that. But next week, this is a map for the predictions for next week. We're going to move right back above normal. In fact, we're going to, by the end of next week, we'll probably be 5 or 10 degrees above the long-term average for this time of year. So expect those warm conditions to return next week as they have most weeks of this winter. The moisture map for next week doesn't look very promising. You can see the tans and the browns are just not really good news for us when we're trying to correct a drought. Don't see anything really significant next week for us to help us to improve our drought conditions in a 1-week period. The seasonal maps that the National Weather Service puts out, they only print these maps once a month. On the 17th of every month, they come out with these seasonal maps. So this information is a little bit dated, but it's the latest outlook map that there is. And you can see for the predictions for the spring months, March, April, and May are temperature-wise going to be well above normal if these predictions come true. That tends to be these predictions are mainly based on that La Nina prediction of staying in control through those spring months. Looking at the precipitation forecast for the spring, well, it doesn't look real good either, especially for those of us in Western Oklahoma that are already experiencing the worst part of the drought in the state. So you can see that basically I-35 East may have equal chances, but I-35 West are going to continue likely to be drier than normal during those spring months. Once we get into late April, May, and June, that's when we receive a significant portion of the rainfall that we receive as a state as a whole. So we really don't want to be dry and miss the kickoff of our growing seasons in those very important rainfall months once we get there. So hopefully things will turn around by then, but at this point in time, the chances just doesn't look that great. Well, what about the drought map? Again, they're released on the 17th of each month. And if you look at the U.S. drought, it's not showing any improvement expected over the spring months here, as you would expect. So La Nina will continue, drier than normal weather, warmer than normal weather, and the western half of the United States will continue to experience drought conditions is the prediction that they're looking for right now. Now I want to end with this slide. It talks about teleconnections. Teleconnections is when a pattern or something happens on the globe that impacts the weather 1,000 miles away or more. Well, that we focused this afternoon on the El Nino southern oscillation or the INSO pattern, and in this case, we're in the cold water phase, which is La Nina. But again, that weather pattern tends to stop influencing our weather as we get out of spring and into summer. So once that happens, once the time of year happens that is no longer an influencer on our weather, there are numerous other weather patterns or oscillations, as they're called, that could impact our weather patterns in the state. And some of them become very important when we get into the summer months. The INSO becomes less significant, and these others become more significant as we move into that time of the year. So hopefully one of these other weather patterns will take over, and we will get some wetter than normal conditions in the summer months that will help us break this drought situation in Oklahoma and further west in the United States. One good bit of news is that there is a map that shows how much rain would it take to move us out of a drought in Oklahoma. And we're not so far into drought right now in western Oklahoma that a 3-inch rain all at one time would pretty much put a lot of our state out of drought. So you know how often that can happen in the spring and early summer. One good 3-inch rain would make our conditions look a whole lot better than they do right now. In summary, I think the eastern part of the state, especially soil moisture wise, looks really good. The western part of the state is probably going to continue to be dry for the next 2 or 3 months to come. With that, I'll close my presentation and turn it back over to you, Dr. Biggs and Dr. Lawman.
Thank you, Wes. So, Dr. Biggs, do you have any questions currently?
I don't see any questions currently. I did want to point out to our attendees today, I put that Oklahoma Mesonet Ag Essentials website is in the chat if you're looking for more specifics. Obviously, the resources that Wes and the Mesonet bring to us in Oklahoma are really critical, and particularly for those of us in the agricultural sector. So I think what we might do, Dr. Lawman, I'm not seeing anything pop up right now, Wes, so you're off the hook for a moment. But I have a feeling when we blend your comments with Dr. Peel's, we may have a few more questions. So if you'll stand by, Dr. Peel will have you bring up your presentation, and then we'll have a little bit of extra time. Again, as a reminder, Dr. Lawman put that in the chat, but you're welcome to put those questions either in the chat, we'll be monitoring that, or the Q&A. So Dr. Peel, I'm not sure you need an introduction. I hope that's okay. I think we have some members of your fan club, including myself, on the line today. So just in case you don't know Dr. Peel, he of course is a professor, Breedlove Professor of Agribusiness within the Agricultural Economics group here at Oklahoma State. And really looking forward to what you have to tell us, Dr. Peel, and blending that with our excellent comments from Mr. Lee earlier.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the chance to be here with you this afternoon. And I really appreciate Wes's comments setting this up. And I appreciate the fact that he ended on a positive note as much as possible, given the situation we find ourselves in. So what I want to do in the next little bit is kind of go over the general market situation that we find ourselves in, and then put that in the context of how that might shape some of the decisions that we might face, depending on what the situation looks like as we go forward the next 2, 3, 4 months in particular, relative to the potential for continuing in drought. So, just bottom line, we find ourselves in a situation where cattle prices have gone up. They were higher in 2021 compared to the low in 2020. Our expectation is that prices will continue generally to trend higher in 2022 and even in 2023, given the trajectory where we're on right now. I'm going to go through the number side, the supply side of things. Obviously, it hinges on the demand side as well. Demand has been exceptionally strong, really through much of the pandemic, but especially in the last few months as we've gotten some of those disruptions kind of under control. And now obviously we've got some new global market disruptions today, and that just reminds us that things can change, and certainly there's potential for additional volatility in these markets. But on January 1, the latest numbers are pretty much down across the board, and that's really the message here. All cattle and calves down about 2%. We've been in liquidation since 2019, so this table goes back to 2019. That was the latest cyclical peak. I'll show you a graph or two that will highlight that. But all cattle and calves numbers has been falling. Beef cow numbers dropped, and they dropped a little more significantly in 2021, coming into 2022, down 2.3%. Some of that is drought impacts that have already affected other parts of the country relative to us. As Wes said, we sort of flirted with drought last year, but really did not face a lot of drought impacts. So you can sort of see across the board, the numbers are getting tighter. That's the bottom line. That's going to support that price outlook that we've got, that we just looked at, and is the general kind of scenario we find ourselves in. Now, drought can play with that, and so we'll kind of incorporate those comments. So here's a view really of why we talk about cattle cycles, what we've been through since 2014, which was a low. We increased to 2019. This is the beef cow herd. So this is kind of the basis for all the rest of supply in the industry. And again, we did drop pretty sharply coming into 2022 here in this red bar. In fact, the year-over-year decrease from 2021 to 2022 is actually the biggest year-over-year decrease in the cow numbers in this country, going all the way back to the last full-blown cattle cycle that we had in the early 1990s. Coming out of that in the mid-1990s, we saw a similar size decrease. Now, there was an attempted cattle cycle here in the middle that really didn't do very much for a variety of reasons. But the cyclical nature of this industry is still pretty strong. Just a quick reminder, this is where the cows are in the country, and they're heavily centered in the middle of the country. The northern Montana is a big cattle state. But really, from the Canadian borders in the Dakotas and eastern Montana south through the Texas border, the bulk of the cattle in the country, 40-something% of the beef cows in the country are in the middle of the country. But cows are found all over the country and are important components of our beef cattle industry, which is extremely widespread around the country. Oklahoma's numbers very quickly match the national numbers pretty close. We were down across the board pretty much. Beef cows were down about 1.3%. And we are the #2 beef cow state behind Texas. I guess you could see that in this graph, this map. We usually run neck and neck with Missouri, but actually Missouri has dropped a little bit more in the last couple of years. We're pretty solidly in second place there. But again, numbers are getting tighter. That's the bottom line. I did want to show you this graph. I sometimes talk about how Oklahoma's cattle industry, beef cattle industry, has continued to grow while much of the rest of the country has tended to decline. Now, these are scaled on different scales. So the US numbers are scaled over here, Oklahoma over here, but you can kind of see the relative changes here. The other reason that this maybe fits into this talk pretty well is a reminder of what happened about a decade ago in 2011, 12, and 13. Really 2011 and 2012 were the two big years of the last similar situation in some respects to what we have now. The winter of 2010 was dry. We went into 2011 with drought conditions that accelerated and forced a lot of change. A springtime drought is particularly debilitating because you just don't get any new forage growth after coming out of a winter. And again, we've got lots of time for that not to happen this year, but if things don't change, we could be facing a somewhat similar situation. So there's a little bit of a perspective there of what we went through then. We did bounce back pretty quickly and again, kind of get back on the same trajectory that we had before, but we went through an awful lot there for about 3 or 4 years. Nationally, the number of heifers dropped 3.3%, the beef replacement heifers last year. That's a pretty significant drop, and it really does limit, and that was partly due to drought impacts last year. And that really restricts our abilities this year. If all of this drought stuff goes away, and we hope it does, we've got really plenty of time for everything we're talking about to not be an issue. And if it does, then, you know, the question of what we would do in the industry will really be constrained by where we find ourselves. We just don't have enough heifers probably to turn around and grow this year, even if we wanted to. That's my playing with the numbers. Again, depending on the drought situation, we may actually be looking at some additional reductions in what we're able to do or what we have to do in response to those conditions. Feeder cattle supplies are getting tighter as well. That plays into the strong feeder cattle prices we're seeing now. It's going to play into what feedlots are facing in the next few months going forward. Wheat pasture is important in the Southern Plains. This is USDA's, this is off of the January 1 report as well. You know, our numbers of cattle out on small grains pasture in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas is about the same as it was last year. I think the difference this year probably is the fact that it has been dry. The wheat pasture has sort of run out of gas quicker, and we've probably been dribbling cattle in here for at least a month off of wheat pasture. And so to the extent that we would normally see kind of a wheat pasture run of marketings, really from now in the next 2 to 4 weeks, we may see less of a pronounced run simply because I think those cattle have already been coming in. Certainly the auction reports would suggest that. Just a quick reminder, again, as a perspective, when you look at where feeder cattle are on January 1, they tend to be heavily concentrated in this Southern Plains region. Again, that's Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. On average, we typically have more than 25% of all the feeder cattle available in the country in this region, even a little bit more than that in these most recent numbers. Wes already showed you this. Drought is very widespread in varying degrees across the country. I did some rough calculations the other day and suggested that if this kind of a situation persists, you know, drought, it could impact somewhere in the neighborhood of 53% of the beef cow herd in the country. And so obviously the potential is there for very widespread impacts that would not only impact a lot of producers in a lot of regions, but would have more likely broader market impacts going forward. Wanted to compare where we find ourselves now to about a year ago, a little bit later in the spring, because that's obviously going into the growing season a year ago. This is kind of what it looked like. The Southwest had been in drought in 2020 and actually did a fair amount of liquidation in 2020. The big thing that changed last year was drought in the Northern Plains, and that expanded later in the summer across most of Montana, as reflected in the current map, really. And so we did see additional drought impacts in that region, along with continuing drought impacts in the Southern Plains and in the West generally. And so, you know, again, if you add now the developing drought in the Southern Plains and in the Central Plains, if that persists and goes forward, we add a bunch more cows to the list of potential impacts. And so it just gets bigger and bigger potentially as this thing goes forward. What happened last year as a result of the drought, you can really see it. South Dakota was the biggest decrease year over year in cow numbers. 189,000 dropped. Montana dropped significantly. Texas lost 160,000. And that's a smaller percentage because they're the biggest cow state. Some of that was drought related. Some of it may not be drought related. And then Missouri was down significantly, and I can't tell you why. It wasn't due to drought, but there's other things going on as well. Wes already showed you this, just the idea that at least for the foreseeable future, there doesn't look like a lot of improvement in much of the region that currently is in drought, with the possible exception of some improvement up in the Pacific Northwest. Wes already showed you this as well. This is where we find ourselves now. And, you know, again, we've got 4 to 6 weeks when we've got plenty of time to fix it before it starts to really be an impact. But, you know, if this persists or gets worse, then those impacts get significant pretty quickly. Market situation going into this, and that'll be important as we might face decisions going forward. You know, we saw a strong rally in cattle prices at the end of 2021 in particular. These calf prices had a very brief seasonal low in early October, a little bit earlier than usual, and then pretty much went up from that point on. And we find ourselves now with these very strong prices. 5-weight calves are over $2 a pound, continuing very strong. And again, cattle numbers are beginning to, the tightness of cattle numbers is becoming more apparent in the marketplace relative to feedlot demand. And obviously this time of the year, to the extent that we can, there'll be a lot of grass demand for stocker cattle as well. Feeder cattle, same thing. They really increased on average through the year last year, trended up, and we start the year significantly higher than a year ago. Now, what's important on both of these, of course, as we go forward, we might be looking at being forced to make some decisions, maybe at a time when we normally don't make decisions about selling calves or feeder cattle or whatever. So it's important to be aware of these seasonal patterns. This is kind of a busy graph. I apologize for that, but it illustrates that what you would expect, all else being equal in these feeder cattle markets, depends on the size of cattle that we're talking about. Now, obviously, that underlying trend of higher prices can modify these seasonal patterns somewhat. But nevertheless, we want to be aware of what sort of is the underlying expectation of these markets. And then, like I said, to the extent that we are forced to or have an opportunity maybe to do things a little bit differently than we normally do, certainly want to be aware of these seasonal patterns. In general, the lightweight calves tend to be higher in the first half of the year and seasonally low in the second half of the year. The bigger feeder cattle are just almost the exact opposite. They tend to be their lowest in the first part of the year and then increase through the summer. And depending on the weights, they may back off a little bit right at the end of the year for the big feeder cattle. Slaughter cattle, obviously feeder cattle prices ultimately are derived from fed cattle prices. Big struggle last year, but these feeder cattle or these fed cattle finally broke loose in November and December, took us up to the level we find ourselves today. At this point in time, live cattle prices tend to be running about 143 to 144. We're continuing to see some strength in these markets. Now we're probably moving to a seasonal peak here in the next month or so. And then there will be certainly some seasonal pressure as we go through the year. But nevertheless, we're on track to average significantly higher for these fed cattle prices as well. That comes from box beef. So all of these things derive from the consumer backwards. Box beef has been strong. It was strong last year and continues generally strong this year. Obviously, there'll be some seasonal nature to that as well. Cull cows may be particularly important in a drought situation. You can see cull cow prices actually were quite strong in 2021. We did not see as much of a seasonal decline in the fall of the year as we often do. But to the extent that we did, we are seeing then the normal or an expected seasonal increase very strong so far this year on these cull cow prices. So that's something that's very important to keep in mind. Again, we get into a drought situation, we could be looking at, potentially facing some culling decisions or some cow sales decisions, even, in the second quarter of the year. And you want to be aware of these things in terms of the market potential. The drought didn't have much impact, at least on a broader scale last year, even though cow slaughter was up about 9% year over year. We didn't see a lot of impacts on this. And that's because the underlying lean beef market that drives these cull cow prices has been and continues to be very strong. However, again, with this expanding drought potential and the potential for such a large percentage of the nation's beef cow herd to potentially be caught in drought, it would be more likely that we would see some broad-based market impacts. And so, it's always the adding insult to injury in a drought situation when you find yourselves at a point where you're forced to sell some cows. And not only that, you're forced to sell them into a low market because everybody else is having to sell cows at the same time. And so that's one of the things you want to keep in mind going forward, is to, sort of anticipate what you're going to need to do, and then maybe try to move a little bit ahead of the broader market impacts. December 1 hay stocks, as reported by USDA for 2021, were actually fractionally lower than 2018, and that makes them the second lowest on this graph, and I think even for several years prior to that. So hay stocks are tight around the country. You know, they've been somewhat tighter in general for the last decade, but we're running about 9% below the last 10-year average for these national numbers. Not surprisingly, if you look at where those hay stocks are the tightest, it's where the drought was the worst last year. And so we actually had a pretty good hay year. Even Texas on average was 28% up on a year-over-year basis. But the Northern Plains, the Dakotas, Montana, 40% or more decrease year over year in December 1 hay stocks. And you have to understand, these are big hay producing states. So when you see a 40% decrease in the Northern Plains or the Northern Rocky Mountain region, that's a big quantity of hay. And I say that to contrast it with, you know, Arizona is not really a big hay producing state. For those producers, a 40% decrease is no doubt very significant. But in a national perspective, it's not nearly as many tons of hay as it is compared to these really big hay producing states. One of the other issues that you have to keep in mind, certainly it's impacting feedlots and some of the feeder cattle markets and prices, as we will see here. But you know, corn markets advanced sharply in 2021. They're going to continue at elevated levels. We're at the highest levels in general now that we've seen since about 2011, 2012. We expect those to persist through the rest of this marketing year for sure. Depending on what the corn crop this year does, we might see some relief in that going into the last part of the year with a new harvest, or maybe not. We just really don't know. That's a kind of a wait and see thing, but certainly for the next 8 months or so, we would not expect to see any significant change in these underlying supplemental feed prices, corn sort of being indicative of that. So what happened in feedlots through 2021? We saw a sharp increase in their cost of gain. That impacts you know, how they run their business. It impacts what they would like to do in terms of you know, generally this would tend to tell them they want to buy bigger feeder cattle and try to cut down some of those feed costs in the feedlot. And the situation that feedlots face in 2022 is that cattle numbers are getting tighter, so they don't have a lot of choices in some cases in what they can place, and they're still going to continue to face these higher feed costs going forward. And so we've sort of got two forces here that are really impacting feeder cattle markets, and I'll show you that toward the end here. So having said all that, that's kind of a quick overview of the overall market situation in general. So let's talk about drought planning, and I'm going to put it in this context. You know, I think the most important thing you can do right now with the possibility that we could face significant drought is to figure out what your end game is going to be. I think that's probably the most important thing, is to sort of think about, you know, if we do have a drought, where do you want to be when we come out of that drought? And I'll say this, I've been around about as long as Wes. We're pretty close, over 30 years. We've been through a number of droughts, and it's been my experience working with producers and the industry through a number of these things. I think this is probably the most important thing to keep in mind. Surviving a drought really ultimately it should be about making sure that you still have a business when the drought ends, not necessarily that you have to have any cows. The biggest sort of impacts and wrecks, if you will, that I've seen in my experience is from producers that are so focused on not selling any cows at any cost. And it turns out that is a very costly thing to do. So making decisions to, first of all, make sure you preserve some financial equity. You may not have any cows when the drought's over, but if your finances are still in good shape, you're going to be in a better position to recover. The second most important thing, and I know you've had previous seminars, webinars on this, but you know, making sure that you protect your forage resources. If you come out of the drought having toughed it through with some cows and abused your pastures in the process, whether it's range or pastures, but particularly rangelands perhaps, and they're in a position where the productivity is going to be compromised for an extended period of time while they heal up, then you've really just postponed the cost of the drought. Same thing for the cows. You don't want to just rough them through and pay the cost later in terms of reduced productivity, reproductive performance, and other things. So it's really important to think about where you want to be when the drought's over, and be in the best position for recovery, and not just sort of muddle your way through it, because that tends to be what gets people in trouble. So what are some of the drought strategies? You know, we're going to think about stretching forage a little bit. That's really more important when we have a summertime drought and we've already produced some forage. Then we start thinking about how to stretch it into the second half of the year. Right now, you know, the spring drought is really a more potentially a tougher situation because we may not grow any forage, particularly. Buying feed is, again, a quick way to get in trouble. That comes from being too committed to a set of cows. One of the other things that I've seen from producers that is to get away from a hay mentality. There's other ways sometimes, at least, that you should evaluate in terms of not just being into I gotta have hay mentality. Stretching forage can utilize supplement feeds. Now, we just talked about the fact that supplemental feeds are more expensive, but the point is you need to evaluate alternatives and not just be locked into a single mindset. Most of these are ultimately going to be in some sort of destocking mode. Relocating may be possible. I'm not going to talk much about it. I think in most cases it's not really a very viable solution, but there are cases where it can be a potential one. Ultimately, we're probably talking about having to sell some cattle, and we'll talk about that. Just don't forget, obviously you won't forget, but you know, we talk about forage, we focus on forage, but if water gets short, that's going to force our hand quicker than anything in terms of having to make some decisions relative to destocking. And so, you know, water management and again, evaluating where you're at with those water resources, pond levels, and so on. It all comes down to making a plan that really is based off our forage or our resource situation, and then noting kind of when we're going to have to make some decisions and what those, and then, you know, put some priorities on some of those decisions. I'll come back to this a little bit later at the end and emphasize this again, but I think that's why we're doing this seminar now, before it's really an issue. 2 months from now, 3 months from now, it'll be a really big issue if things don't change, but it's important to start that planning now. You know, there's a lot of things that could come down to destocking. It's going to depend on whether you're fall calving or spring calving. You know, typically we talk first and foremost about culling early. These are not in any particular order, I should say. These are kind of the order I thought of them, but they're not in a priority order. I think that's something you're going to have to determine depending on your situation. But one of the things that typically comes out is just making culling decisions early when those cows are supposed to be rebred, checking them, you know, 3, 4, 5 months ahead of when you normally would check them and make those culling decisions. You may have some heifer calves in development that you're planning for replacements. You know, we've got awfully strong feeder cattle markets, so that's one of the things that you might want to divert. I think that's what happened last year that contributed to the significant decrease in beef replacement heifers coming into this year. It was a combination of the bred heifers, but mostly the potential replacements, if you will, that were in development. You know, we may be in a situation with this spring kind of a drought. If you're spring calving, probably not going to sell cows right now. As Wes said, we're probably in calving season or very close to it. But if things get tight, we might want to think about selling some pairs fairly early in the spring, if in fact we're still very dry. You know, the cull cow market is strong and the bred cow market is pretty strong at this point in time. I'll show you a little bit of seasonal patterns for those in just a second. Weaning calves early, again, spring calving, you know, spring calving by midsummer, well ahead of when we would normally wean. You can think about weaning calves. I'll talk about the implications of what you do with those calves in just a minute. And then, you know, you may be in a situation where you have bred cows or bred heifers all of these, and really the key is to look at your situation, your timing relative to this, and sort of figure out a priority list of when these things might come into play. Cull cows, just a reminder of the seasonal pattern there. As I said earlier, we've seen a pretty seasonal but very strong increase in prices. That's pretty typical. They hang in there pretty well until about June, maybe July, and then they certainly tail off towards the end of the year. A massive drought situation that forces a lot of culling would push this down much sooner. So, again, be aware of that we could get into a situation where we put a lot of pressure on that seasonal price pattern by mid-year or earlier than usual if we get into a lot of drought force culling. Bred cows actually have a very similar seasonal pattern. This is not in graphical form, but coming into March, bred cow prices on average are at their seasonal peak. And by July, they'll drop about 12% from, this uses a May base, from 7% above the base to 5% below the base. And then even a bit lower, perhaps seasonally by the fall of the year. So again, those are all things to keep in mind. If you can figure out ahead of time what you're faced with in terms of sort of inevitable decisions, and then try to make those decisions relative to the market, that can help you out and not be in the double whammy of being forced to sell and also being forced to sell into a depressed market. Wanted to talk about the calves for just a second here. This was last November. So we were seeing already, as I pointed out earlier, a significant rally in calf prices. We had high feedlot cost to gain. And if you looked at the value of gain at that point in time, it was very strong. It tended to match that higher feedlot cost to gain, in that there was a lot of value in the market for putting weight on feeder cattle. So there was a lot of incentive to background calves, obviously wheat pasture, to the extent that we had it or have it, that played into that in the prices at that point in time. This graph shows what's happened from then until now. So this blue line is that same set of prices from that previous table of numbers. This is what the prices look like from small calves, small steers in this case, up to the bigger feeder cattle. And that value of gain comes from the fact that that line is relatively flat. There's not as much of a rollback as usual. There's a lot of value of gain. Again, one of the biggest drivers of feeder cattle price relationships is that feedlot cost of gain. What's happened between then and now, this was last week's average prices in Oklahoma, is we've seen the lightweight calves go up sharply, not much change in the overall price level in the big feeder cattle. They're kind of constrained by that high cost of gain. And so there hasn't been much change there. Well, when you raise these relative to these, if you start looking at the value of gain for putting weight on feeder cattle in the current market situation, it's dropped sharply. And so I say all that to say, and again, that's just because these high priced calves or these calves are much higher priced. And what that means is that if you get into a situation where you're in, let's say, early weaning, the calves, you could keep them and background them. You're faced with purchasing feed to do that, coming up with a program that works. But in fact, there may not be as much incentive to think about doing that rather than just going ahead and selling them at relatively light weights in the situation we're in. And what's happening here is that the feedlots still have high cost of gain, but they're also faced with the fact that cattle numbers are getting tight. That's what's bidding up those calf prices by and large, is just that numbers are getting tighter. And so, the last couple of months of cattle on feed reports have showed that feedlots are placing lighter weight animals, not because that's what they really want to do, but simply because that's what's available for them. And so they're bidding up those lighter weight calf prices. And so we're going to see that. So all of these things are things that need to be evaluated if you get into a situation perhaps of early weaning calves, and then trying to figure out again whether to maybe think about backgrounding those calves or not. You need to evaluate these kind of situations. So Are there any current forage situations? You know, again, we probably have 6 weeks or so before, you know, things really get critical. But I think it might be worth taking stock now of forage and feed resources. My impression is that in general, we've got plenty of hay to get through the winter, but you might want to think about whether you want to use it all up and not have any flexibility. And so I just throw these out as things to think about. I don't know, you know, to what extent they might apply to you, but fall calving herds, you know, again, you're in a situation now where you could think about weaning early, potentially taking advantage of the current strong calf market that we have. And if necessary, even think about selling some bred cows at this point in time. On wheat, we don't have a lot of wheat in many cases, but if we have stocker cattle out there, we might go ahead and pull them even if we were planning to graze out. And to the extent that we get any wheat, then that we could use that for cows or help stretch our hay supplies and perhaps not use them completely up. We need to monitor these developing drought scenarios, because what happens not only in Oklahoma or in the Southern Plains, but also in other parts of the country will impact the market. So right now we have widespread drought. If that continues, then we have a much higher potential of broader based both cattle and forage market impacts, and obviously just less flexibility in a big geographic region compared to you know, to other situations. We could have a situation where the drought continues here and improves other places. You know, that would obviously not be good for us, but it might actually give us more flexibility in terms of you know, the availability of forage in other regions or hay in other regions. We might see regional market impacts that are not as broad-based from a national standpoint. The opposite could happen, where we have drought improves here but remains elsewhere. And that's actually what happened to some extent last year several times. The drought sort of attempted to move into Oklahoma, but then retreated. And, you know, that lets you kind of stay on your game plan here for what your longer term objectives are. I've had several questions over the last several months, knowing that there was drought in other regions, about, you know, buying and having cows or heifers available. There will be some recovery, obviously, at some point in time. That will be important and maybe an opportunity if that situation exists. And the last one is the one that we hope for, right? We hope all of this that we've talked about are things that we ultimately do not need. If the drought improves on a broad basis across much of the country, then that's the other scenario. The point is, I think you have to monitor this not only in terms of what you know, what you experience locally here, but really on a broader based regional basis. Finally, you know, again, I'll sort of emphasize a couple of key points. Drought is very emotional and stressful. And again, I've been through a number of droughts. I've talked to a lot of producers over the phone, really struggling, really stressed with the decisions, in many cases, decisions that they know they need to make, but they're really having a hard time making them. And early planning is one of the keys to that. Having a guideline in place that will give you the discipline to make timely decisions when they need to be made. I guess that's the definition of timely, and take some of the emotion out of it. This business of just hanging on for another week or another month can really be not only difficult for you emotionally and mentally, but also financially, unfortunately. So it's important to have an end game in mind and plan for the recovery, and keep that in mind going into it. Got a couple minutes, maybe, Dave. Hopefully I didn't run us plumb out of time if we've got some questions.
No, we're good. We've got time for a few questions. Dr. Peel, I just looked up right quick. I really appreciate the connection of the feed yard cost of gain to those values of gain. So I just looked up December closeouts from Justin Wagner's newsletter from K-State. Steers closed out in December, like 23,000 steers, over 12 feed yards, I believe, at the cost of gain of $1.08. And heifers were an average cost of gain of $1.15. So
right,
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Biggs, I noticed we had a question or two in our chat.
We've got a question here, and it's a little bit of a situational, so I want to make sure I'm just going to read it as it has been typed. This gentleman's partners and himself are planning on selling some cows in preparation to invest in stockers for drought management, as well as some other reasons. Currently, the current operation is cow calf on native grass, but are looking to create more of a mixed cow calf stalker operation instead of just that straight cow calf. In both herds, they'll both run on the same pasture. Do you have any recommended articles or tips for operators looking to diversify that cow calf operation by bringing in those stalkers with
them? Dave, you can help here too, potentially. Just a couple of thoughts come to mind. I don't know that I'm thinking about resources, and we may have to follow up with this. You know, in general, I like the idea where it makes sense to have a mixed cow calf and stocker thing, because that does give you flexibility to manage variation in forage production. Running them in the same pasture is kind of an interesting twist. There's probably some, Rosalind, there's probably some vet and biosecurity concerns that would come into that. So that would be something to think about. But in terms of the overall sort of management and utilization of those resources, I like the flexibility that having a stocker component gives you, and I think that makes sense as a consideration. We'll have to work on maybe some follow-up resources that we can get to help with that. Dave, do you know of anything?
Well, the one thing that comes to mind, so in let's say a fall calving scenario, that's exactly what people do. They might not think of it that way, but we have a lot of big ranches in Oklahoma that choose to calve in the fall and then leave the calves on the cow through the spring of the year to let that cow really bounce back rapidly on the lush forage growth. And hopefully we're going to get some of that this year. And those calves are gaining well over 3 pounds a day at the same time. And then they wean those calves and move them on to something else, whether they market them or move them into the feed yard or whatever. They're in July or even up to early August. And that is kind of it's a little bit of a different take on it, but that's their way to utilize that forage an intensive early stocking program. And they cut way back on their forage requirements there in July as we get into the dry part of the summer. And then you can just modify that program or that plan earlier and earlier in the year if you're challenged with drought.
Exactly.
You can move the calves on out sooner. The cows will gain more condition earlier, which will save you in feed costs the coming year through the fall and so on. So, that was the thing that came to mind, Dr. Peel. The other thing I guess I would mention is that unless you have a specific marketing program for your retained replacement heifers in extreme drought scenario, that class of cattle is a really, really good candidate to market. Okay, now that's hard to do if you've spent a lot of time on the genetics and saving back the really nice looking heifers and so on. But let me tell you, that class of cattle makes a lot of sense to market now in the high market that we're dealing with, Dr. Peel mentioned, and so on, because they are a long ways away from bringing you a return. They're the most difficult cattle to keep in condition after they calve, and they're the most difficult set of cattle, cows, females, to get bred back.
Yeah, and they're going to be the most expensive, even more than normal when you're chasing feed resources in a drought situation.
Absolutely.
I'm going to jump in here on the question just from the health aspect of it. I think it needs to be, Dr. Peel, of course, thank you for mentioning biosecurity component. That's a big big focus for me. And I think Obviously, your veterinarian can be a great resource for you to try to develop health plans and biosecurity plans, as health plans should be part of your biosecurity plan. We've got some good resources fairly recently released for biosecurity plans, some templates through beef quality assurance, and some training there that you may want to think about. And there's all, some different approaches depending upon the source of those stockers, how you want to do that. So don't forget the health aspect of it when it gets to it, because you sure don't want to bring in a group of stockers that jeopardizes the calves on the cows or the calves cooking at the current time. Wes, I've got a question for you. Since we're on the topic of resources, talk to us a little bit about some of the other things that Mesonet, for those that maybe aren't as familiar with Mesonet, I know we've got a smartphone app and some other things. Maybe visit with us about those resources that might help us as producers.
Sure. We have been in existence for a long time, getting close to 30 years. So we have tremendous amount of historical data. So you can look at trends and things of how these weather patterns are likely to play out. But on top of all of the raw weather data, whether it's barometric pressure, solar radiation, rainfall, or temperature, we have value-added programs that can help producers to help make decisions on the farm. One of them that is very pertinent to this time of year is a first hollow stem advisor that takes into account wheat variety and soil temperature units to help producers determine whether we're in a dual crop wheat forage situation to pull the cattle off of that, or at least to begin scouting those fields to look at that. We have multiple other value-added programs, some for cattle, some for producers. This time of year, there's an alfalfa weevil monitor out there that's very important that help you to know when to start scouting, possibly when to expect to have to spray alfalfa fields. So don't just overlook the temperatures and the raw data is important, but take the time to take a look at some of those value-added programs that are primarily only on the website at mesonet.org. The app is great, but at this current time, we do not have most of those value-added programs on the app. Come this summer, we're going to release a new program that should solve that situation. But between now and then, I would advise people to maybe direct your attention to the website and see if there's something you might have overlooked or might be useful to you.
Dr. Biggs, Dr. Beck, as we wrap up here, let me just suggest for those of you that are still on the webinar, if you have time and you don't mind typing in a topic that you would like to see in the future Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime series, we'd like to see that. We're planning the next series now. We'll keep a close eye on this drought situation. You know, if we get a lot of feedback that folks would like to, have specific questions about how to deal with drought and so on, we'll do our best to try to address those in a timely fashion. Dr. Biggs, Dr. Beck, do you all have anything else?
My only, I want to reiterate what Dr. Peel said, is having that plan early for these drought or potential drought conditions, and trying to take the emotion out of it, which I think is hard for most of us to do. And don't forget, we talked a little bit about resources here in the discussion at the end. Don't forget our county educators. They have the ability, they're right there on site with you, and can help you customize these plans in some ways, or get you those resources that are more specific to your particular area of the state or operation type. So with that, that's all I have, Dr. Lallman, and I just want to thank everybody for being on.
The comment I think really wanted to bring back up was when Derrell says, start culling early before all your grass is gone, because you can really have a lot of impact on future forage production, and it'll take a lot longer for it to recover if you graze everything completely into the dirt. So, have your flexibility and have your plan and take those steps, in a timely fashion before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. Thank you, Dr. Peel. Tremendous resource will be available to everyone on our website. We're praying for rain and hope everyone has safe travel here through the rest of this week here in Oklahoma with the slick conditions and so on, but we're glad to get a little bit of moisture. Hope to see y'all soon on our next Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime series.
We should have a survey that pops up for you as well. We're taking note of those suggested topics in the chat. So thank you all for those. And feel free, take a moment. Actually, if you'll do it for us, it would be great. Fill out that survey at the end, because we do take a look at that information and use it for our planning purposes.
Very good.